All right, open your Bibles, if you would, to 2 Samuel chapter 7. 2 Samuel chapter 7. There is a line in an old hymn that says, "What He takes or what He gives us shows the Father's love so precious." The name of the song is Security. And it's easy for us to sing the part that says, "What He gives us shows the Father's love," but the other side is not so easy to sing. What He takes from us shows the Father's love. We think of love as something that is giving, and sometimes, though, love is something that takes things away that would not be best for us. Think of maybe your broken dreams. Think of the times that you felt like you wanted to do something for God, and God had this great plan for your life, and you thought you knew exactly what it was, only to have it stopped or only to have it cut short, because the Lord said, "No, that's not my plan. That may be your plan, but that's not my plan." That may be a noble purpose. It's a good desire for you to want to do that, but that's not exactly what I have in mind for you. That has happened to me. It happened to Becky and me in ministry. And it's hard to hear. And David hears that very kind of thing today. He has finally come to a place in his life where things are quiet and peaceful and calm. After many years of fighting and running and hiding and more fighting, now we see David at a time of calm and quietness and peace in the kingdom. 2 Samuel chapter 1, verse 7 says, "After the king was settled in his palace, and the Lord had given him rest from all his enemies around him." Now, David has been on the run for more than 10 years. And he has been fighting for all of this time. 2 Samuel chapter 7 actually has 3 scenes in it. Real quickly, let me tell you. David wants to build a house for God. That is his desire. He is standing there before God. He's got his tool belt on. He's got a hammer in one hand and the saw in the other. And he says, "God, I want to build a temple. I want to build a house for you." And that is his desire. He says, "Here I am," in verse 2, "Here I am living in a house of cedar while the ark of God," or the ark of the covenant, "remains in a tent." And so Nathan the prophet tells him, "Hey man, whatever is on your heart, do it, because the Lord is with you." So that's scene 1. The next scene is that very night, God speaks to the prophet Nathan and tells him to tell David, "Hey, wait up. Not so fast. You're not the one that's going to build a house for me. In fact, instead, I am going to build a house for you. I'm going to build a dynasty for you. Not a house to live in, but I'm going to build a dynasty for you." And then the third scene at the end, we see David going in and sitting before the Lord and just humbly giving thanks and praise to the Lord for the covenant that the Lord has made with him. Now, the storyline is really simple. David begins with this great desire to do a great work for the Lord. And God replies by saying, instead, "I'm going to do a great work for you, David. You're not going to build this house for me, but I'm going to do a great work for you." And he is going to do that because he is a gracious and loving and merciful God, and he is blessing his servant. So David began this chapter with his work clothes on, ready to go to work for the Lord. But God says, "No, stop. I want you to just stop. Just stop." And then at the end, we see David sitting and resting before the Lord. So we have an energetic David ready to go to work. We have a gracious promise from God that God is going to do great things for him. And then we have a restful David sitting in the presence of God. Now, that's a wonderful story, isn't it? That is a great story. 2 Samuel, I apologize for coughing. I'm going to do it today, okay? Just plug your ears. I apologize. 2 Samuel chapter 7 is really a pivotal text in the Bible. We might call it a game changer. How many of you have been watching basketball this week? The rest of you are pagans, evidently. So anyway, you will notice that during a basketball game, sometimes there is one play that turns the tide, and the losing team starts coming back, or the team that was behind gets the advantage and never looks back. Well, 2 Samuel chapter 7 is kind of a game changer like that. The story of David has been full of action, action, action. I mean, from the first time we met David, he's always been a man of action. But in this chapter, there is no action. There's only conversation. God speaks to David, and David speaks to God, and the chapter contains the longest speech that we have seen from God, that we have read from God, since God gave Moses the law back on Mount Sinai. So this is the longest oration that we hear from the Lord since then. So something big is happening. What is it? Well, have you ever had an ominous if hanging over your head? An ominous, omnipresent, it seems, if. I mentioned this in Sunday school. My son-in-law's family is going through this right now. My son-in-law has a little nephew that is 8 months old. He's one of twins. His name is Christian. He has been a sick little boy all of his life. Just Thursday night, he got a new liver. Just Thursday night, he got a liver transplant. We're praising the Lord for that, and we are mourning with the family that has lost someone who donated this liver. But we're praising the Lord that God provided it for Christian. But now, hanging over the family, it has been this big if he gets a liver, if he gets a liver. Fortunately, it came at just the right time. The little boy was just so near death. But now the big if that is hanging over their head is if his body rejects the liver, which could very well happen. And only time will tell. So I would ask you to pray for little Christian. But have you ever lived with that kind of a big thing hanging over your head? There's a story from ancient Italy called the Sword of Damocles. In this story, a man named Damocles was a part of the court of a tyrant ruler. His name is Dionysius II. Damocles was talking to the ruler and remarked how wonderful it must be to have such power and authority. And so the ruler says, I'd be happy to trade places with you for a while. I'll be happy to switch places. And so Dionysius has arranged to hang a sword right above the throne by a single hair from a horse's tail. So Damocles comes into the throne room and sits on the throne surrounded by luxury, and happens to look up and see the sword hanging there perilously. This illustrated to him the kind of fear that great leaders often live with. There's a big if hanging over our heads. This is also a powerful picture for anyone who has lives in the fear that at any moment the sword will fall. Have you been there? Oh, things are going great, but I just know it's going to get bad. We've met some of those people, haven't we? Things are just going wonderful. Denny Smith, I'm picking on him. Denny Smith will say, "Well, I was doing better, but I got over it." That's the kind of the thing he says. So anyway, but have you ever felt that way? Have you ever felt like if I make a mistake, oh, the sword is going to fall? If life is difficult without having the anxiety of this big thing hanging over us, isn't it? Life is difficult without that. But when you've got something ominously hanging over your head, it makes it even more difficult. constantly living with an if over your head. If I get that job. If she says yes to my proposal. If the boss likes my idea. If we get approved for our home loan. If my health stays intact. You understand what I'm saying? Those things make life difficult, hard. Relationships that are based on ifs are just hard to enjoy. I have performed several weddings, and not in any one of them have I ever included the word if in the vows. Wouldn't it be a terribly uncomfortable ceremony for everyone if the vows were conditional promises? Listen, when the bride and groom make their vows, they are unconditional promises. I pledge to you my love, for better or for worse, for richer or for poorer, in sickness and in health. But what if we had said, well, I pledge to you my love if you don't do anything that annoys me. I pledge to you my love if you don't gain more than 20 pounds. I pledge to you my love if you make me happy or if you don't disappoint me. How miserable a ceremony would that be? How miserable a marriage would that be? Relationships that are ruled by ifs are filled with worry and stress and very little joy. Well, God had made a relationship with Israel based on ifs back when He gave the law to Moses, and before to Abraham when He made the covenant with Abraham. The Mosaic covenant is a covenant that God made with Israel at Mount Sinai that was absolutely filled with if. You take a look at it. If you obey me and live up to my commands, then I will bless you and I will be with you. But if you don't, I will destroy you, God says. Now, they were living under the sword of Damocles. This huge if sword hanging over their heads. But something game-changing happens in 2 Samuel chapter 7. God makes a covenant with David. And in this covenant, the ominous if kind of fades into the background. It's not completely erased, but it kind of fades into the background. And when God promises to build a house for David, listen closely to what He has to say. Look in 2 Samuel chapter 7, beginning with verse 12. When your days are over and you rest with your ancestors, I will raise up your offspring to succeed you, your own flesh and blood. I will establish His kingdom. He is the one who will build the house for my name. I will establish His throne, the throne of His kingdom forever. I will be His father, and He will be my son. When he does wrong, I will punish him with the rod wielded by men, with floggings inflicted by human hands. But here's a very important word right here. Some translations, instead of saying but, will say nevertheless. So, nevertheless, my love will never be taken away from him. Nevertheless, my love will never be taken away from him, as I took it away from Saul, whom I removed from before you. Your house and your kingdom, David, will endure forever before me. Your throne will be established forever. Now think about this. This ominous if that has been hanging over the heads of the Israelites all of these years have been overridden by an unconditional, everlasting nevertheless. The title of the message today is Nevertheless Forever. Because in verse 15, God says that when David's offspring sins, that God will discipline them, but He will never take away His love from them. He will never do it. And the result is that David's house and his kingdom will be established and sure forever. And this is because of no other reason but God's grace. David didn't deserve this, but God graciously gave it. The if fades into the background, and God speaks a new word here. Nevertheless. And the covenant that Moses had at Mount Sinai was full of ifs all the way through. But the covenant that God made with Israel through David is an irrevocable, unconditional, unilateral, everlasting promise. Now, parents need to let their kids know, I'll love you no matter what. I love you no matter what. Even when you act bad, even when you disobey, I love you no matter what. Our kids, our children, and our grandchildren need to know that when they disobey, they will be disciplined. But just because we discipline them, that will never take away our love for them. They will never, no matter what they do, no matter what they become, they will never, never, never be in danger of losing their parents' love. It's a nevertheless love, not an if love. Now, there may be a belt hanging in the closet, but there's no sword hanging over their head. Becky mentioned to me a couple of days ago as we were talking about this, how the Awana kids, the TNT kids, love to sing, "Your love never fails, it never gives up, it never runs out on me." And that's their favorite song, I guess, one of their favorites. Your love never fails, it never gives up, it never runs out on me. What God was saying to David is that, David, no matter what, David, you will forever have a son sitting on the throne, ruling the people of God. Now, that's quite a promise. And so this promise was a promise to God's people through David. Does that make sense? It was to Israel, but through David. And it was their source of hope in hard times. Remember, the Lord said, they would continue to go back. Remember, the Lord said, no matter what, nevertheless, forever. And this was a promise, and still is a promise, that they hold to. Now, don't forget the context of this promise. I've already said, David wanted to build a house for God. He wanted to build a temple for God. But God said, no, that's exactly, though, what I'm going to do for you instead. And in verse 8, he begins his speech to David by saying this, I took for you from the pasture, from tending the flock, and I appointed you ruler over my people Israel. David's rise to the throne had nothing to do with David's doing. It was all God. David wasn't fighting and clawing his way to the top. He was simply content to serve the Lord as a shepherd. But God brought him to this position. It was all God's work. And the same thing is true for the future house of David. God speaks of what is going to happen in the future and tells about David's descendants. Look in beginning verse 9. There are over 20 verbs in this speech where God is the subject. And he says, I will do this, I will do that. Over 20. Let me just give you a sampling of them. I'm going to be not jumping around but skipping parts. Beginning of verse 9. I have been with you wherever you have gone. I have cut off your enemies. Now I will make your name great. Verse 10. And I will provide a place for my people. Verse 11. I appointed leaders. I will also give you rest from all your enemies. The Lord himself will establish a house for you. Verse 12. I will raise up your offspring. I will establish his kingdom. Verse 13. I will establish the throne of his kingdom forever. Verse 14. I will be his father. When he does wrong, I will punish him, but my love will never be taken away from him. God says over and over again, I will establish, I will make, I will be, I will raise up. God gives all of these promises, and with promise after promise, God squeezes out any credit that David may take for this. It's all God's doing. All Him. And David's response, we see in verse 18. Then King David went in and sat before the Lord. This is a picture of the child of God resting in the grace of God. What a beautiful picture it is. Of course, he didn't just sit there. He prayed, he talked to God, and he offered humble thanksgiving. Verse 18, the second part, who am I, sovereign Lord? And what is my family that you have brought me this far? And he confessed that he believed God's word, what God had spoken. And his last words in verse 29, Sovereign Lord, you have spoken. And with your blessing, the house of your servant will be blessed. So we see the child of God sitting and resting in the grace of God. God tells David, who has been active, going, always working, hey, it's time for you to not be active. It's time for you not to achieve. It's time for you to just sit back and receive from me. Eugene Peterson says that Christians are characteristically afraid of being caught doing too little for God. But there are moments far more frequent than we suppose when doing nothing is precisely the gospel thing to do. Now, I think he's hit the nail on the head. I don't want us to just sit back and be lazy, but there are times when God wants us to just sit back and enjoy Him. Psalm 46:10, be still and know that I am God. Matthew 11:28, come to me, all you that are weary and heavy laden, and I will give you rest. I will be your rest. So David has traded the part of Martha. Remember in the book of Luke, Martha was scurrying around preparing the meal and running here and there. And she gets mad at her sister Mary because Mary's not helping in the kitchen. Instead, Mary is sitting at the feet of Jesus. Well, David has traded the part of Martha for the part of Mary. So now Israel has this covenant, this irrevocable, this unconditional, unilateral, everlasting promise from God. Now there may be hard days ahead, but they will face those hard days with this promise in hand that David will always have a son or a man on the throne of Israel. David will always have a son on the throne of Israel. And this promise is a promise that gave Israel hope. Gave them hope. As the years go by, David's sons disobey God. Until finally God disciplines them by sending them into exile. And the if had not been completely erased, remember. They disobeyed, so God punished them. And in exile, they mourned and they suffered and they groaned. And we have some of the songs or psalms that they sang. Lord, why have you forsaken us? Lord, don't you remember your promise? In fact, in Psalm 89, Ethan the Ezrahite says, Lord, where is your former great love, which in your faithfulness you swore to David? Where's that love you promised us, God? In fact, Psalm 89 reminds us, or tells us that Israel reminded the Lord of the promises that He had made. Lord, this is what you said. Look in Psalm 89, verse 28. Lord, we're reminding you, you said, I will maintain my love for him forever, and my covenant with him will never fail. I will establish his line forever. If his sons forsake my law, verse 32, I will punish their sin with the rod. Verse 33, but I will not take my love from him, nor will I ever betray my faithfulness. I will not violate my covenant or alter what my lips have uttered. Once for all I have sworn by my holiness, and I will not lie to David. Verse 36, that his line will continue forever and his throne endure before me like the sun. It will be established forever like the moon. So they're reminding God. They're singing this song. God, you promised us all this stuff. You promised all of these things. You promised that Israel would always have a son of David on the throne. God, where is that promise? Where's the completion of that promise? And they kept singing those songs all those years, sometimes centuries, with no son of David on the throne like God had promised. But they kept reminding God of his promise. They kept reminding and they kept singing about this irrevocable, this unconditional, this unilateral, this everlasting promise that God had made. And the promise that God had made gave them hope in the darkest days. They said, God, remember, you have overridden the if, and you have given us, we're trusting you for the nevertheless. It would have been unbearable for Israel in those dark days of exile if not for the certainty that God would eventually keep his promise. They couldn't have lasted. Someday, God will remember. Someday, God will make good on what he said. And they remembered David just sitting before the Lord, trusting. That's the picture they had of their king. And one day, many years later, a baby was born in Bethlehem, in the city of David. The New Testament begins his story like this in Matthew 1:1, a record of the genealogy of Jesus Christ, the Son of David. Folks, Jesus is the final fulfillment of God's promise to David of an everlasting king on the throne. Jesus is that promise. And he is still on that throne today. The Father had not forgotten his promise. He sent his Son, Jesus, the Son of David, the Son of God, to fulfill his promise to Israel. And God has not forgotten his promise to us as well. And in Jesus Christ, you and I can claim the promises that God gave to David and to Israel. We can receive his unconditional, everlasting, unilateral love. And I invite you to do that today. Listen, folks, he came to give us hope. Jesus came to give us peace. He came to give us security. He is our rock. He is our comfort. Jesus will never fail us. So I invite you to place your trust in him. No matter what you're going through, no matter what difficult time, no matter what ominous if is hanging over your head, I invite you to place your trust in him.